Hey guys. All right. In chapter 20 and 21, Goethe and Fritz were really hopeful. They started digging and tunneling, but it starts to get a lot harder. And they have to start taking some risks to cover up their activities. And Frau Eberhardt starts to get nosy about what they're doing. And we're reminded that Fritz has to join the military in 3 weeks. Okay, remember as I'm reading to you chapter 22 and 23, keep these big ideas in your mind of trust and risk. How are Goethe and Fritz and all the other characters dealing with their trust? And how are they taking risks and deciding which risks they should be taking to do and get what they want in this situation that they're living in? Okay? I slept late the next morning, and when I awoke to bright sunshine, I darted from my bed. Why was it so quiet in here? Had Fritz overslept too? He wasn't in his room, and when I called his name, there was no answer. Now in a panic, I ran into the front room. He was definitely gone, and his shoes were missing from beside the door. My first thought was that he had gone over to the welcome building on his own, but I hoped that wasn't the case. We had agreed that it was always safer for the two of us to go there together. So Fritz and Goethe, they really have to trust each other, don't they? They're taking these risks together, and so they have to trust each other. Still, I went on a hunt for my shoes, wherever I had pulled them off in the fog last night. While looking for them, I spotted a note on the kitchen table from Fritz. It only said, "Be back soon. Stay here." There was no word about where he had gone or why or how long he would be gone other than soon, which was useless. Was it something dangerous? Was that why he chose to go alone to keep me safe? Because if so, then how could I be sure he would be back soon, or even that he would come back at all? With my heart threatening to pound out of my chest, I began pacing the floor. So this part, where Goethe's anxious about where her brother is, that really made me think, does she trust Fritz, or does she really trust anyone at this point? He'd said nothing last night about any errands. Claudia had broken off their relationship, so he wasn't sneaking out to spend time with her. Or at least I thought the relationship was over. If she wanted him back, I knew he'd agree to it in an instant. He talked about her all the time while we were digging, but our conversations about her always ended with him knowing they could never be together. Claudia was fiercely loyal to her father, and her father was no less loyal to the GDR. He wouldn't trust Fritz within a kilometer of her. Finally, I gave up pacing. Not because my anxiety was any better, but because I suspected whoever was on the other end of the hidden microphones might somehow figure out that I was pacing and wonder why. We had dishes in the kitchen sink that hadn't been done for days. I washed those up and then swept the floor of all the dirt we had tracked in. Slowly, I became absorbed in that work, because even if I didn't know what was happening with Fritz, at least I was doing something. I went to make my bed, but realized the sheets were filthy from the dirt that came in on my hair and clothes that night. It didn't seem right to make up an unclean bed, but I didn't feel like washing the sheets and hanging them to dry either. A quick glance at Fritz's bed showed he was even worse than mine, and I left them both unmade. It was only then as I slowed down that I realized how hungry I was. I'd missed supper last night, and the sandwiches I made for Fritz and me at lunch had gotten thinner every day. Fritz hadn't told me how much money Mama sent her in her last letter, but he felt like we ought to save whatever was left for the tunneling supplies rather than groceries. The more I went through our empty cupboards, the more I disagreed. We needed food. Mama kept a cookie jar on top of the refrigerator. I never went into it because, as far as I could tell, it had never held cookies or sweets of any kind. But our food supplies were getting low. If she had stashed anything in there, I wanted it. I opened the cookie jar, and immediately all my hopes deflated. It was empty of food anyway. An old envelope was at the bottom, though, and I pulled it out, then caught my breath in my throat. It was a letter from Papa. The stamp dated it to September 1961, about the time the wall replaced the barbed wire fence. I pulled out his letter, which began, "To my dear family," but every line after that was blacked out with thick black marker, every single line. No wonder Papa never wrote to us. There was no point in it. The envelope was addressed with our apartment number, and the return address came from West Berlin. If the return address was current, maybe that's where Papa lived now. And maybe his letters were blacked out, but if I wrote him, would my words be blacked out too? So why do you think the GDR is censoring the family's letters. Remember that word censoring from our last book? When someone decides what you can see and what you can't? By doing the thick black marker, somebody was censoring the letter. I wonder why. And do you think if Goethe sent a letter to her father, then that government would censor it? Or it would be censored on the way out? What do you think? I couldn't see anything wrong with a daughter writing to her father in the West. No matter who the father was, and no matter what the daughter really wanted, it should be okay. Well, that last part wasn't true. I had to be careful. The letter I wrote to my father was simple. I said nothing more than what we absolutely had to be written, and weighed each word carefully, just in case the Stasi intercepted it. So intercepted means like they would get in the way, like stop the letter and look at it before it gets sent. Papa, I hope all is well with you. We are all fine, though Mama is out of the city to take care of Oma Gertrude's broken leg. Could you please send some money to help us plant a garden? Fritz is looking for work and we need a little extra. Love, Goethe. I debated whether to mention anything about the tunnel, but couldn't figure out a way to word it that wouldn't tip off the Stasi. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, none of them more important than whether Fritz and I were doing what he wanted by digging that tunnel. But I wasn't foolish enough to write a question like that. Before I could talk myself out of sending the letter, I put a stamp on it, and then ran down to the street to drop it in the post office box. That's where I was when Fritz came running up to me with a paper in one hand and a bag in the other. What are you doing out here? He asked. Nothing, I frowned at him. Where were you? I've been worried. Fritz pulled me near the wall of our building and showed me the paper. They're called Schrebergärten, allotted spaces for interested families. The state gives permission to garden in certain areas legally. I went to ask if we might use that small piece of land near the Welcome Building to make a garden. The paper is our permit, and in this bag, I even have some small gardening tools and corn seeds. They just gave them to us? The condition is that we don't own the land, and we certainly can't live on it, and technically they'll own everything we grow, though they said we could share in the harvest. They don't mind that it's so near the wall? A lot of farmland comes up to the wall, so they're used to it. Fritz's smile was so wide it nearly spread off his face. Don't you see? We have a reason to be there now, even their permission. We don't have to sneak on and off the property anymore. My brow furrowed. We have files, Fritz. Why would they give us permission? Fritz shrugged. The Stasi keep the files. Maybe the agriculture office doesn't know about them. He showed me the paper again. This is good news, Goethe. This could save us. I couldn't share his relief or excitement. This only changed one big problem into a different sort of worry. Yes, but now we'll have to build a garden instead of digging. When are we going to do that? Fritz smiled, so pleased with himself. We'll figure it out, Goethe. Now come on, we've got work to do. All right. If you need to take a break, now would be a good time. If you're ready for chapter 23, then stick around. As slow as it was to dig out the rock in the tunnel, at least we had been making progress there. The next few days were spent almost entirely in the garden, working hard for no other purpose than as a cover for what we were actually doing, or should have been doing. I didn't mind the idea of gardening, but the weeds were thick and sometimes thorny, and by the third day it was hard to care about the dirt out here when I really wanted to be down in the tunnel working. After an entire afternoon of pointless, sweaty labor, I didn't think the weeds looked any better than when we first began. When the heat of the day hit us, Fritz and I decided to sneak inside the building to get back to our real work. And as before, he went into the tunnel while I removed dirt with the bucket. But the small basement room was already piling high with dirt, and that bothered me. We had a long way to go before we reached the west. What if we ran out of places to store the dirt? Something needed to be done with it. I briefly toyed with the idea of returning to the weeding. At least the weeds didn't require me to think so much. Then I smiled as a wonderful idea came to my mind. If it worked, it would solve both my problems. Rather than dump out the bucket inside the basement, I opened the boarded window and dumped it there. It made a much smaller pile than I expected, so I refilled the bucket from the dirt already in the basement and dumped it outside too. After 5 or 6 loads of dirt, I climbed outside and then used a small hand rake from the state to spread their dirt around. It went down smooth and dark, and covered up every single weed beneath it. I didn't need to pull out weeds, I could just cover them up. Sure, our vegetable seeds wouldn't grow very well once they hit that hard ground a few centimeters down, but I didn't care about that. I didn't plan to be here that long. With renewed energy, I began emptying dirt from the basement. The routine was the same, to dump several loads at once and then spread it out. I did it slowly and tried to make it look as if I was pulling weeds rather than covering them. The watchtower was far away enough that unless the guards looked carefully, there wouldn't be any reason to investigate further, or at least I hoped not. I was always listening for the approaching sounds of one of their vehicles. After a while, Fritz called up to ask what I was doing, and when I invited him up to see for himself, he only chuckled and brushed his hand across my head. "Trust you to do so much hard work to get out of other work," he said. "But don't go so fast. If someone is looking for progress, they'll never believe we got all that weeded in a day." He was right, and I returned to carrying dirt back up the ladder. Over and over, that was my routine. Climb down the air raid shelter. Scoop dirt into the bucket, hook it over my arm, climb up the ladder, dump it out, repeat, again and again and again. Rest a little and then start all over. I'd lost track days ago of how many times I made the climb. I could do this now in my sleep. Who knows? I was so tired, maybe I did. I usually took my rest in the shelter while I watched Fritz's progress. He was nearly 5 meters into the tunnel and kept track of how straight it was with some boards he had nailed together, perpendicular to each other. A perpendicular is a math term, a geometry term that talks about when two lines are shaped like this. So this is perpendicular. So you can imagine it. If one end was always kept straight with the shelter's entrance, the other end should point like an arrow in the direction he should dig. One late afternoon, Fritz said he would lift the buckets for me if I would go and find water to refill his canteen. It required a short walk back to the main part of the city, but I was eager for the change of routine. I stripped off my overalls and stopped by the pond to wash my face and hands. If I was going to convince a restaurant to give me water, I needed to be presentable enough to walk inside. Then I set off toward a nearby sausage shop where the family used to eat. When I was almost to the restaurant, my eye roamed across the street to a building that had been bombed during the war and still hadn't been repaired. Attempts had been made to clear it some years ago. I could tell that because of some rusty old machinery and other pieces of equipment left on the site. There was even a long rope with a pulley attached so that the heavier items could be lifted onto trucks. A pulley. So I'm going to pause here and just give you a visual of what a pulley is. Okay, so a pulley is when you have a rope that goes through a wheel like this, and it makes it easier to lift something. It takes the less effort to pull a higher load. My mind began racing as I pictured that very item in the basement of the Welcome Building. With a pulley, there would be no more climbing up and down the ladder. Fritz could fill the dirt below, I could pull it up with a rope and then empty it in the basement. We could work twice as fast with half the effort. I needed that pulley. "Goethe, what are you doing here?" I swerved around and saw that Anna had come up behind me. Her mother was already seated inside the restaurant where I intended to get water, though I hadn't noticed either of them before now. It shouldn't have surprised me to see them here. This was their neighborhood, after all. But of course she would be surprised to see me, and looking as dirty as I'm sure I did. I stepped back and forced a smile to my face. "Fritz and I are gardening, like I told you about earlier. I just came to refill our canteens." "Let me get it for you," she said, and then wrinkled up her nose. "No offense, but you smell like you're up to your eyeballs in gardening." That was true enough in a way. I handed her our canteens, and she took them inside while I waited, trying as hard as I could not to look at the pulley on the other side of the street. It was only attached by another thick rope. With a good knife, I could cut it free, but when? Certainly not on a day as busy as this one. The problem was that in this neighborhood, every day was busy. It was only at night, after curfew, when everything went quiet. After a few minutes, Anna emerged with full canteens of water so cold I could feel it through the metal. I wanted to gulp down an entire one right then. "Thank you," I said rather awkwardly. She called out, "You're welcome," as I walked away, which thoroughly confused me. Were we friends again? Why? Nothing had changed. Unless it had changed on her end. Maybe the Stasi had decided to leave her family alone, and she felt safe to be friends with me again. I didn't know if I was ready for that. After all, she had treated me horribly over the last couple of months, and I had much bigger things on my mind than anyone's friendship, which included a need to get into her apartment, I reminded myself. For the sake of the tunnel, I would have to make things good between us, and soon. But in the meantime, I had a pulley to steal.